Hello everybody, and welcome back for another video. Today we're going to be talking about the timeline manipulation with a focus on the first millennium, 1 to 1000 AD or CE for Common Era. And the basic premise of this video is going to be talking about this concept that the Roman Empire actually fell all at once because of more of a singular event, sort of a catastrophic event, as opposed to a gradual fall as it's normally laid out and described to us, and how they might have added false years into the timeline, specifically the first millennium. That's kind of going to be our focus. How could they have stretched out the timeline and hidden this from us? So that's what we're going to talk about, and I'm also going to be introducing the work of somebody I came across recently that was introduced to me, and I think I'm excited to share it with you guys. But first, let me just talk about the reason why do I think the Roman Empire fell suddenly as opposed to gradually. And a lot of it comes by looking at the ruins. And now initially, a lot of this, it makes sense. They give various explanations as to why it's in a state of ruin, and whether it's earthquakes or invading forces. So we have Algiers in 1890, and you have various explanations, Temple of Bacchus and Baalbek. Those explanations make sense to me. And but where things start to fall apart a little bit for me is when you look at all of the parts of the Roman Empire that are buried. So I think the explanation for why Rome was buried, and we've probably all seen these photos, maybe some of the video, where portions of Rome were buried in like 20, 30, 40 feet of sediment. And I believe the explanation was because of the aqueduct system was in disrepair, so that area got flooded. And on its own, that kind of makes sense. And even, places like in Africa, like Timgad in Algeria, northern Africa, we're told it was buried in the sands for 1,000 years. So that kind of makes some sense to me. But where I guess things start to fall apart for me is when I look at the bathhouses, because whatever country they're in and whatever even continent, they seem to all be buried 10 plus feet. So just this year in southern Spain, 2021, a Roman bath complex emerges from Spanish sand dunes. So they found this Roman bath complex completely buried. People would walk over this and they just didn't know it was beneath their feet. And I believe these walls are about 4 meters high. So we're talking well over 12 feet. So that's a lot of sand, to cover an entire structure and complex. It's it's hard to believe that's natural, and we have, I believe in 2020 in downtown Amman, Jordan, they were experiencing flooding, so they were going to try and rectify that problem by improving their infrastructure. And during excavations, they stumbled upon a Roman baths that nobody knew was there. And again, it's like 10 plus feet, 10, 15, 20 feet deep. And I think the explanation was there was an ancient river that caused this portion of the city to be buried. So it's just harder and harder for me to believe that all of these various sites in different countries are constantly being buried. Here's just another photo image of that one site in Amman, Jordan. Look at these guys down here, just way down. But, the UK, United Kingdom, is a treasure trove of buried Roman, architecture. In Silchester, in England, again, they found another settlement with a bathing complex, bathhouse, and again, just like 10 plus feet deep. And it's just, so we're totally different countries, North, South Europe, Middle East, it doesn't matter. And I talked about this one, Roman baths in Bath, England. I believe it was like I think it was 1870s thereabouts, but they discovered this Roman bath that was buried, and I think the river Avon was the culprit. And again, a lot of times they'll say it's a river, but this was an interesting one. Again, in England, Exeter Cathedral in Exeter, England, they were digging for a car park about 10 feet deep. They ran into another Roman bath, and they didn't know it was there. And in this case, I believe they say they intentionally built, the cathedral builders intentionally built on top of the bathhouse. So over here, it's intentional. Over here, it's a river. I'm not even sure what the reason is here. Over here, it's a river. It just keeps changing, but the theme is a constant theme, and it's buried 10 plus feet all the time. And when you start looking at the buried Roman villas again in the UK, just some of the explanations, this was one of the more far-fetched ones. When the Romans left Britain, it appears that some villas were covered with dirt to trap into them the spirits of the Romans. What are you going to do with that? It's just on top of all this, it's just not believable to me. So I thought the most logical place to look for sort of false narratives and added years might be to look at the Anglo-Saxon period, because when you look at Exeter Cathedral, you have this culture, the Roman culture, right, and Roman settlement. And then from my perspective, there was a disaster event that buried it. And then you have the cathedral building culture, right? So you've got these two separate cultures that are pretty defined. But in England, we're told in between those two cultures, you had the Anglo-Saxons. So if there was going to be false narratives, false years, I figured that would be a good place to look. And my focus was just looking at architecture. So we're told a lot of the Anglo-Saxon architecture was made of wood. So it hasn't lasted or survived, which makes sense. But we are told that there are some remnants of Anglo-Saxon churches that we can look at. So when you start looking at these churches, some interesting narratives pop up. And this particular church, St. Lawrence's Church, Bradford-on-Avon, it's apparently or allegedly one of the very few surviving Anglo-Saxon churches that does not show later medieval alteration or rebuilding. So just kind of doing a little bit of background on this structure. Immediately, according to the Wikipedia, it says the date of the building has been much debated. And then I came across a YouTube video. Somebody else, Charles Koss, he had an interesting video titled, "Oops, is UK's oldest Saxon church actually late Roman?" And I think he was pointing out some of these arched windows. But I thought that was interesting. And so looking into this church a bit more, I came across this Carolingian Renaissance, this specific type of architecture that belonged to this Carolingian Renaissance. So the interesting thing about this Carolingian architecture, it was the style of Northern Europe, and primarily in the 8th and 9th centuries. And the thing about it is that it was a conscious attempt to emulate Roman architecture. My basic premise going into this was that there was an event that destroyed the Roman civilization, and some of their structures probably survived. So here we have this type of this Renaissance, which features this architecture, which is trying to recreate older Roman architecture. So what I'm thinking is that this structure was pre-existing. It survived whatever event happened, but they're just classifying it as Anglo-Saxon. That's my view. So, sure enough, when you look under Carolingian architecture, this particular church shows up as an example of that, and it's dated to this time frame, but I'm thinking it belongs to this previous to the Roman civilization and culture, as opposed to the 8th and 9th centuries. Now, speaking of Carolingian architecture, there is one more example I want to go over, because I think it's going to tie into the point I was trying to make with the church that we just talked about. And this structure, it is called Ingelheim, and it was an imperial palace of this Carolingian dynasty. Charlemagne is said to have stayed there, as well as some other rulers, but it's an example of this Carolingian architecture, which very much looks like an older Roman palace and villa from 500, 600, 700 years ago. But we're told this structure was built in the second half of the 8th century. Now, the intrigue sort of creeps into the picture, because in the late 1800s they found a water tunnel that was part of this complex, and this water tunnel was made waterproof by this hydraulic Roman mortar, this Roman cement. And why does that have any significance? Because the recipe for Roman concrete, Roman cement, we're told it was lost to the world when the Western Roman Empire fell, which is roughly 476 AD. So 300 years after we're told that the recipe for Roman cement concrete was lost, 300 years later, roughly, it makes an appearance in this imperial palace, which we're told was intentionally designed to look like an older Roman-styled imperial palace. So I guess what the point that I'm trying to make is that I'm of the belief that this structure is actually older than they're saying. It was actually built in the earlier part of the first millennium, and they've just pushed it forward, through this means of calling it a Carolingian architecture. That's my speculation anyway. But I thought this was a really interesting example, so I just wanted to mention that. Now, there's a second method, I guess, that I think they're using to sort of push or claim certain structures as being older than they are, and that's called Spolia. And it's just this idea of repurposing building material from one structure and using it in another structure. So what you will come across when you start looking into these older, what we're told are typically churches from this Anglo-Saxon period, a lot of them will say this structure was built using the brick and stone from like some other Roman structure, but really it's from this period of time. And I guess what I'm speculating is, in actuality, these structures were initially built with Roman brick and stone, and maybe modified later, but they're actually from that time period. And this is one example, this chapel of St. Peter on the Wall. And we're told it was likely built around this period of time. But again, they say it incorporates Roman bricks and stones. But, I can see a lot of arches here. And again, can't prove this, but I suspect that it actually started out as it was built during the Roman occupation. And I think and there was probably other Roman structures around it that were in ruin, and so it gives them a likely story to use. But again, that is speculative. And here's another example: All Saints Church in Brixworth. Now, we're told this is a leading example of early Anglo-Saxon architecture. And when you look into this structure, so this is kind of the front of the church, and we're going to go to the back here. But according to Wikipedia, this structure as well was built using reclaimed Roman stone and brick. Now, when you go to the back of the structure, the ground level changes significantly on the sides and on the at the back of the structure, and you can see a gentleman way down here So it's quite a change in the grade. And I think I've got another photo here. This particular section, I just kind of got a zoomed photo of that. It's interesting just to see, like, I think this structure was actually built during that Roman occupation. This event happened, and this church got covered in layers of earth during that event. And maybe they've modified it after the fact with other, construction. But I think the base of it was Roman brick and stone, and they've just added to it. But I think the mud flood effect around it speaks to it actually belonging to the previous Roman occupation. But again, that's my view. So now let's get into talking about this phantom 700 years in the first millennium. Okay, now I'd like to introduce the research of this individual, Gunnar Heinsohn, and he talks about catastrophe and chronology, which are two subjects I enjoy researching myself, but his focus is in the first millennium AD. Now, I came across this link to a video of his on stolenhistory.net. Thanks to whoever posted that. I appreciate that. But he has a video that I'll leave a link to, and it's maybe slightly over an hour long. And he has so much material that it'll be impossible for me to encapsulate all of it. But the basic premise of his work is, and research, especially into the chronology of the first millennium, his basic premise is that the first 200 to 300 years of the first millennium AD, there's reality to those, but the next, roughly speaking, 700 years or so are phantom years. They didn't actually happen, and there's various techniques that our controllers have sort of employed to stretch the timeline, and we're going to talk about some of those. But what I want to do is just give you a brief snapshot into some of the examples he gives and talks about. And if you're interested, I'll leave a bunch of links and you can investigate further. But let's start in Rome. Now, again, his concept is that the first, roughly speaking, I think he's pretty exact with it. I think he usually says like the first 230 years there's reality to those, but the next 700 are fictitious. So when he started looking at what was happening in Rome itself during this 700 years after the first 230, he realized like no apartments were being built in Rome for this 700 years. No latrines were being built in Rome for this 700 years. No aqueducts were being built in Rome for this period of time of 700 years. And in addition to, we mentioned the residential quarters, latrines, aqueducts. In addition to that, no sewers, roads, ports. He threw in bakeries. Basically, nothing is being built within Rome itself during this period of time of, roughly speaking, 700 years. And he just cites different excuses given, like why didn't the emperors build? Why wouldn't the senatorial class build? Like, why didn't the aristocracy build? Like the elite, how come they're not building? Like no one's building anything. But the one thing that is being built during this 700-year stretch within Rome are churches. Now, again, what we're told, these churches that are built like in the 4th and 5th centuries, we're told that they're designed to look like these 300-year-older basilicas of antiquity, the first 300 years. So they're dated 4th, 5th, 6th century, but they look just like the basilicas of the first 3 centuries. And then if you go into the 300 years after that to the early medieval period, again, these churches, basilicas, they look like the churches and basilicas of the first 3 centuries once again. So it's just, I believe his point is that this is just a means of extending the timeline. And his view, and I tend to agree, is that these churches were all built at the same time during the first 230 years or so of the first millennium. Now, and again, just one example here, this church, Santa Maria, it was built, I believe, in the 5th century, yeah. And it's a beautiful church. And when you go on the Wikipedia and start reading on it, one scholar talked about it, saying it so closely resembles a 2nd century imperial basilica that it has sometimes been thought to have been adapted from a basilica for use as a Christian church. So he's just noting, yeah, it looks just like a 2nd century imperial basilica. And the premise here is that the reason why it looks like that is because it was actually constructed during the first 3 centuries, the same time frame. But the controllers, they're using this dating system to add phantom years to the timeline. Now, Roman capitals, other Roman capitals are being established in the 4th and 5th centuries, we're told. And it just so happens that they're laid out and they resemble Rome in the 1st and 2nd centuries, which is interesting. And he just makes a point that, like, within these other Roman capitals that we're told are rising up, being constructed in the 4th and 5th centuries, all these buildings are also being constructed. So why is there's all this construction, just like Rome 300 years ago? But how come nobody's building anything in Rome during this period of time? Interesting point. And he's just saying that all these cities look similar because they actually exist side by side at the same time. So just another point he makes, which is valid points. Now, there are so many, I'll leave links to his website, but there's so many like PDF documents that you can open up, and he touches on all these different locations, and I'm just going to hit on maybe 2 of them just so you can kind of get the basic pattern. And he talks about this place called Pliska, and it's in present-day Bulgaria, I believe, and it was the first, according to the narrative, it was the first Bulgarian capital between 681 and 893 AD. So in the 7th century, we're told this city was established, and according to the research he's done, it has similar layout to a Roman city and settlement. And looking at this site, there are 2nd century Roman bricks associated with it. So you have this 7th century city that has a layout of a older Roman city, and it also has building materials associated with it from the older Roman construction. But it also has this Roman style. They found a Roman style hypocaust heating system, and apparently these tunnels resemble in shape and execution Roman tunnels. But the kicker is they found these walls of these tunnels, they found a reservoir. Yes, they found a reservoir, and its walls were plastered with that Roman cement. And once again, this Roman cement. So this city was established in 681. The recipe for Roman cement, Roman concrete, was lost in like 476 or something like that. So we're talking like 200 years later in Bulgaria, they've got building material from the 2nd century Rome. They've got this, the Roman cement shows up again, which was, lost to history. So there's all these indicators that this city was actually built at the, during the first 3 centuries. So they're contemporary with each other. Instead of this city being from 681 AD, it actually probably dates to the first 3 centuries AD. It was concurrent with Rome of the first 3 centuries. That's why you have the building materials, the Roman cement, that harken back to Rome. So that's an interesting point. And I just wanted to add, this is Bulgaria here, and you have, this is where Pliska would be, and here's Constantinople down here. But there's a city called Varna, and not far from Varna, there's this stone desert. And I believe there's only 2 deserts in Europe, and this is one of them. And it's by this place called Varna, but you can see Pliska is very close. It's not that far from this stone desert. And when you look into what happens with Pliska, it comes to a terrible end. A dark gray layer strangled the urban jewel for good. So the mud basically shows up. And they say that between the 11th and 15th century, Pliska Basin was turned into a desert landscape. So I guess the idea here is this site got, whatever this catastrophe was, it hit Pliska, this Bulgarian city, we're told. It hit it at the same time as whatever hit Rome did. Interesting stuff. Now, just one more example. Let's go to Northern Europe and look at the Vikings, because the Viking Age, roughly close to almost 300 years, not quite, but 250 or so. But they place the Viking Age during the later portion of the first millennium. Now, in his research, he's just looking at it, asking some pointed questions like, why did these Scandinavian raiders waste the first 700 years of the first millennium before they could finally bring themselves to build ports and use sails? It is an interesting question, because he just points out, we know that there was Roman settlements all throughout England, the UK. So how could they reach England but not the neighboring Scandinavia? So when he's just comparing these 2nd century Roman square sail trading vessels compared to what we're told are 10th century Viking square sail trading vessels. And I think the point he's getting at here is that the Vikings actually existed concurrently with the Roman Empire, Roman civilization of the first 3 centuries. Instead of being from, this period of time, roughly 250, 300 years, at the end of the millennium, they were actually they coexisted, is the point he's trying to make. And he's just comparing this first, 2nd century Roman, this square sail war gallery, and comparing it to what we're told is an 8th and 9th century Viking square sail war gallery. And he's saying they're similar because these people coexisted. They're running concurrently at the same time. And he also notes that you find a lot of 2nd century Roman coins in a lot of these Viking settlements, and you find a lot of these low value coins. They don't have a lot of value. So the idea that they're hoarding them doesn't make a lot of sense. So I guess what he's insinuating here is the reason why you have a lot of these 2nd century coins and low value coins is because they were trading with them. They were using them because they're from that time period. as opposed to like these coins being passed down for like 700 years. And yeah, so they find a lot of artifacts from the first 3 centuries in these Viking sites. They also find this Roman millefiori glass, this 1st century Roman glass. They find it in what we're told are these 8th century Viking sites. They're running at the same time. That's why they have all these artifacts and coins. A lot of these Viking settlements, just like Pliska, that get buried under soil, layers of earth, and they get abandoned. And this is just one called Truso in Poland, and there's another one in Norway. But so we're given all different times for these places, existing, and then there's some disaster that befalls them and they get abandoned. But what he's saying is that the catastrophe that affected Rome also affected Pliska in Bulgaria, and it also affected these Viking sites. And these Viking sites and Pliska and Rome, they're all concurrent with each other. And they're not like 700 years apart. So they've inserted phantom years, and he's got a lot to say about a lot of other things. And he talks about the Anglo-Saxons and Constantinople, the Middle East. He just goes into a lot of different things. So I'll leave some links. And again, this is what I've just shared is a fraction. I didn't even cover like some of the more impressive points, but I'm trying to give you a basic feel for what is being proposed. And so I think I'll leave it here for today. Until then, take care. Bye.